House Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for a thorough answer to things I didn't quite ask. I did note the report. I did review it recently, and one of the things that stood out was the predominance amongst stakeholders, citizens, interest groups, First Nations, local governments about the lack of conservation and protection of ecosystems on private managed forest lands. British Columbia invests less in the protection of wildlife per person or per hectare than any other state or province in the Pacific Northwest. The discrepancy is startling, with Washington State, for example, spending 23 times more per square kilometre to protect wildlife. Earlier this year, the BC Wildlife Federation released a report noting the following, quote, "While the human population, resource extraction and threats to habitat and wildlife have increased significantly, the funding and capacity to support natural resource management have declined. This is the opposite of other jurisdictions and the opposite of what British Columbians expect." I note the very powerful statement given by the member for Fraser-Nicola about the decline of steelhead as an example of what we are seeing right now with, in respect to endangered species around this province. My questions for you, Honourable Speakers, to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Without provincial legislation dedicated to protecting species at risk, how does he intend to mitigate the loss of wildlife in our province, particularly at a time when climate change has already begun to alter entire ecosystems?
Minister of the Environment and Climate Change Strategy.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. One of the reasons that species at risk legislation is included in my mandate letter, and the reason that I have assured the member in the past and the public that we are working on it and that we intend to bring it in this mandate, is what we inherited after 16 years of failed promises from the former government. The failure by the former government to take any meaningful action has meant that it's become harder to protect BC's ecosystems and species, and we've created instability for Indigenous communities and industry. We have, for the last 2 years, been consulting broadly with communities, with Indigenous nations, over 120 Indigenous nations in 22 regional sessions, to work together with communities, industry, stakeholders, Indigenous people, and environmental scientists to find a path forward to protect BC's species at risk in a way that works for everyone. We take that seriously. We're continuing to work on that. But we have and will continue to take action in the meantime as we try to get the legislation right. We did, for instance, sign an agreement with Canada and the Syilx Okanagan Nation to establish a national park in the South Okanagan Similkameen. This is a region, Honourable Speaker, that is home to 11% of Canada's species at risk, and I look forward to working with the federal government, with the nations and with British Columbians to bring these kinds of protections to this irreplaceable region and others throughout British Columbia.
Thank you.